In the humid heart of Savannah, Georgia, where Spanish moss hung from ancient oak trees like gray funeral veils and the air itself seemed thick with the weight of history and secrets, there existed a row of elegant townhouses on Jones Street, where the city's finest craftspeople plied their trades. In 1921, this street was home to silversmiths and furniture makers, portrait painters and clockmakers, each competing to create works of such beauty and precision that their names would be spoken with reverence throughout Georgia and beyond. But among all these skilled artisans, none possessed a reputation quite like Elizabeth Mae Thornton, whose wedding dresses were said to be so exquisitely crafted that brides wept when they first saw themselves wearing her creations. This is the story of a seamstress whose dedication to her craft transcended every reasonable boundary, whose final masterpiece would be completed under circumstances that defied all rational explanation, and whose death on her own wedding day would create a mystery that would haunt Savannah for generations. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from and if this is your first time on our channel. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories from the shadowed corners of history where beauty and horror intertwine in ways that challenge our understanding of devotion, obsession, and the terrible price of perfection. The Thornton family had lived on Jones Street for 3 generations, occupying a narrow 3-story townhouse painted pale yellow with white shutters and a small front garden where Elizabeth's mother, Margaret, grew camellias and gardenias that perfumed the air in spring. The ground floor housed Elizabeth's workshop, a spacious room with tall windows that captured the afternoon light, shelves lined with bolts of fabric in every conceivable color and texture, and a large work table where Elizabeth spent 12 to 14 hours each day transforming cloth and thread into wearable dreams. The middle floor contained the family's living quarters, modest but comfortable, while the top floor had been converted into a storage space for completed dresses and the extensive collection of fashion plates and design books that Elizabeth consulted for inspiration. Elizabeth herself was 26 years old in 1921. A slender woman of medium height with dark brown hair she kept pinned in a simple bun, and pale blue eyes that seemed to see the world in terms of line and form and possibility. She had learned sewing from her grandmother, Ruth Thornton, who had been a respected dressmaker in Savannah since before the Civil War. Elizabeth's education in needlework had begun when she was only 6 years old, sitting beside her grandmother and learning to make stitches so small, and even that they were nearly invisible to the naked eye. By age 12, she was creating complete garments. By 16, she had taken over her grandmother's business when the old woman's eyesight failed. By 20, Elizabeth's reputation had grown so substantial that wealthy families from as far away as Charleston and Atlanta would travel to Savannah specifically to commission dresses from her workshop. What set Elizabeth's work apart was not just technical skill, though her stitching was certainly impeccable, but rather an almost supernatural ability to understand what would make each individual woman feel beautiful. She could look at a client and immediately envision the perfect dress for that person, taking into account not just body type and coloring but personality and dreams and the image the woman wished to present to the world. She worked without patterns, creating each dress as a unique piece, cutting fabric with such precision that almost no material was wasted. Her clients said that wearing one of Elizabeth's dresses was like wearing confidence itself, that somehow the garments made them feel like better versions of themselves. The wedding dresses were her specialty and her passion. Elizabeth approached each bridal commission as if it were a sacred trust, spending hours in consultation with the bride-to-be, understanding her vision for her special day, learning about her relationship with her fiancé, capturing the emotional essence of the wedding, and translating it into silk and lace and satin. She kept a leather-bound journal where she recorded details about each bride and each dress, notes about preferences and personalities, sketches of designs, samples of fabric. This journal was her most precious possession, containing the accumulated wisdom of hundreds of weddings and thousands of hours spent in pursuit of bridal perfection. By 1921, Elizabeth had created wedding dresses for 217 brides, each one documented in her journal with meticulous detail. In the spring of that year, Elizabeth herself became engaged to Thomas Whitmore, a 29-year-old architect who had recently moved to Savannah from Atlanta to work on the restoration of several historic buildings. Thomas and Elizabeth had met at a client's wedding where Elizabeth had created the bride's dress, and Thomas had been hired to design the venue's renovations. They had connected over their shared passion for craftsmanship and attention to detail, recognizing in each other the same dedication to excellence that drove their respective work. Thomas was tall and lean with sandy brown hair and green eyes, known for his gentle manner and his ability to see the inherent beauty in buildings that others considered beyond saving. He courted Elizabeth with old-fashioned formality, bringing her flowers every Sunday, taking her for walks along the waterfront, where they would discuss architecture and fashion, and the ways that both disciplines involved creating beauty from basic materials. After 6 months of courtship, Thomas proposed on a warm evening in April, presenting Elizabeth with a simple gold band that had belonged to his grandmother. Elizabeth accepted immediately, and they set the wedding date for June 18, 1921, a Saturday when the weather would likely be pleasant and the garden flowers would be in full bloom. The guest list would be small, just family and close friends, about 40 people total. The ceremony would take place in the garden behind the Thornton townhouse, with a reception in the parlor afterward. Thomas's parents would travel from Atlanta, along with his 2 sisters and their families. Elizabeth's small family, her mother, her younger brother Michael, and a handful of aunts and uncles, would fill out the guest list along with several of Elizabeth's longtime clients who had become friends over the years. But the centerpiece of the event, the element that Elizabeth cared about most, would be her wedding dress. For the first time in her career, she would create a dress for herself, pouring into it all the skill and passion she had developed over years of serving other brides. She began work on the dress in late April, immediately after accepting Thomas's proposal. The design she envisioned was complex, ambitious, perhaps the most challenging project she had ever attempted. The dress would be made of ivory silk satin, cut on the bias so that it would flow like water over her body, with a fitted bodice featuring intricate hand embroidery in silk thread that matched the fabric so closely that the pattern would be visible only when light hit it at certain angles. The sleeves would be long and fitted, ending in points that extended over the backs of her hands. The neckline would be a modest bateau style, appropriate for a garden wedding. But the back of the dress, that would be the masterpiece. Elizabeth designed a back panel that would button from the base of the neck to the waist with 47 tiny pearl buttons, each one hand-sewn with such precision that the spacing would be mathematically perfect. Below the buttons, the dress would fall in a graceful train extending 4 feet behind, edged with handmade lace that Elizabeth would create herself using techniques her grandmother had taught her. The embroidery on the bodice would depict gardenias and magnolia blossoms, the flowers that grew in her mother's garden, rendered in such detail that they would appear almost three-dimensional. Elizabeth estimated that the dress would require approximately 300 hours of work, and she gave herself 8 weeks to complete it, working in the evenings after finishing her commissioned pieces during the day. She began with the lace for the train, spending her evenings in the workshop with the windows open to catch the breeze, her hands moving with practiced precision as she created yards of intricate lace pattern by pattern, thread by thread. Her mother would sometimes sit with her during these evening sessions, reading aloud from novels while Elizabeth worked, a companionable routine they had maintained since Elizabeth was a young girl. As the weeks progressed, Elizabeth became increasingly absorbed in the dress, often working late into the night, sometimes not coming upstairs until well past midnight. Her mother gently suggested that she was pushing herself too hard, that she should rest more, that the dress would be beautiful without quite so much embellishment. But Elizabeth insisted that this dress needed to be perfect, that it needed to represent the culmination of everything she had learned about her craft, that she wanted Thomas to see her on their wedding day and know that he was marrying not just a woman but a master craftswoman who would bring that same dedication and excellence to their marriage. By early June, Elizabeth had completed the lace, the embroidery, and the basic construction of the dress. All that remained was the final fitting, the attachment of the pearl buttons, and the finishing details that would transform the garment from merely beautiful to truly extraordinary. But those who saw Elizabeth during this time noticed changes that troubled them. She had always been slender, but now she appeared almost gaunt, her cheekbones too prominent, her wrists too thin, dark circles under her eyes suggesting insufficient sleep. She moved through the workshop with a dreamlike quality, her attention entirely focused on the dress to the exclusion of almost everything else. She had stopped attending church services, something she had done faithfully every Sunday since childhood. She barely ate, claiming that she wasn't hungry, that the work sustained her. Thomas visited several times during the first week of June, concerned about Elizabeth's apparent exhaustion. Each time she assured him that she was fine, that she was simply determined to finish the dress, that once the wedding was over, she would rest. She showed him pieces of the dress, the intricate lace, the detailed embroidery, and his face showed genuine awe at the beauty of what she had created. He begged her not to work so hard, to take care of herself, reminding her that he would love her in any dress, that the ceremony was about their union, not about the garment she wore. But Elizabeth just smiled and kissed his cheek and promised she would rest soon, that she just needed a few more days to complete this final masterpiece. On June 10th, 8 days before the wedding, Elizabeth's mother found her daughter unconscious at her work table, slumped over the partially completed dress with a needle still in her hand. Dr. Henry Morrison was summoned immediately. He was the Thornton family's longtime physician, a kind elderly man who had delivered Elizabeth and treated her through all the usual childhood illnesses. His examination revealed that Elizabeth was severely exhausted, possibly malnourished, running a low fever that suggested her body was under extreme stress. He ordered complete bed rest for at least a week, insisting that Elizabeth must stop working immediately if she wanted to be healthy enough to marry on the 18th. Elizabeth reluctantly agreed to rest, allowing her mother to help her upstairs to her bedroom. But the next morning, Margaret found Elizabeth's bed empty and the workshop door locked from the inside. When she knocked, Elizabeth called out that she was fine, that she just needed a few more hours to finish the button attachment, that she would rest afterward. Margaret spent that day outside the workshop door, alternately pleading with and threatening her daughter, but Elizabeth would not open the door or stop working. The sound of her needle and thread could be heard through the door, a soft rhythmic sound that continued hour after hour without pause. By evening, Thomas arrived and added his voice to Margaret's, begging Elizabeth to open the door, to take care of herself, reminding her that a dress was not worth sacrificing her health. The response from inside the workshop was barely audible, Elizabeth's voice sounding thin and distant, but the words were clear enough. "This dress must be perfect. I have to finish it. Just a little more time." The needle sounds continued through the night. On the morning of June 11th, the sounds from the workshop finally ceased. Margaret and Thomas waited several minutes, then knocked on the door. No response. They called Elizabeth's name. Silence. Thomas made the decision to break down the door, something he would regret for the rest of his life. The workshop, when they finally entered it, was dim despite the morning sun, the curtains having been drawn across the tall windows. The air smelled of fabric and thread and something else, something sweet and sickly that neither Margaret nor Thomas could immediately identify. And there, seated at her work table in her usual position, was Elizabeth Mae Thornton. She was wearing the wedding dress, and it was complete. Every button was attached, every seam was finished, every detail was perfect. The ivory silk satin glowed softly in the dim light, the embroidered gardenias and magnolias seeming to float across the bodice, the train spreading behind the chair in a graceful pool of fabric edged with the intricate lace. Elizabeth's hands were folded in her lap, holding her needle and the spool of thread she had been using. Her eyes were open but unseeing, her face peaceful, almost serene. But Elizabeth Mae Thornton was dead, and from the condition of her body, had been dead for several hours, possibly since late the previous night. Dr. Morrison was summoned again, arriving within 20 minutes to find a scene that would haunt him for the remainder of his career. Elizabeth's body was still seated at the work table, still wearing the completed wedding dress, her position so natural that at first glance she appeared to simply be resting between stitches. But when Dr. Morrison examined her, he found that she had been dead for at least 6 to 8 hours, possibly longer. Her skin was cool to the touch. Rigor mortis had already begun to set in. Her eyes showed the cloudiness that develops in the hours after death. Most disturbing was the fact that the dress she was wearing was not just complete but perfect. Dr. Morrison had seen Elizabeth's work before, had attended weddings where her dresses had drawn gasps of admiration. But this creation exceeded anything she had previously made. Every stitch was absolutely precise. The spacing between stitches so consistent that it appeared to have been done by machine rather than by hand, though Dr. Morrison knew that every inch of the dress had been hand-sewn. The 47 pearl buttons running down the back were attached with such perfect symmetry that they appeared to be a deliberate design element, rather than functional fasteners. The embroidery work was so detailed that individual petals and stamens were visible in the flower designs. But here was the thing that made Dr. Morrison's blood run cold. The dress had not been on Elizabeth's body when she had collapsed over it the previous day. He had been present when she was carried upstairs to bed, and at that time, the dress had been spread on the work table, approximately 80% complete with many of the buttons still unattached, and the final details of the embroidery still unfinished. Yet now, less than 18 hours later, Elizabeth was wearing the completed dress, and the quality of the completion work matched the quality of everything she had done before. The implication was inescapable. Somehow, Elizabeth had put on the partially completed dress, and then had continued working on it while wearing it, completing the button attachment, finishing the embroidery, adding all the final details, working with the dress on her own body, continuing to sew even as she died, her last stitches as perfect as her first. Thomas Whitmore stood in the workshop doorway, unable to fully enter the room, staring at the woman he had planned to marry in just 7 days. She looked beautiful in the dress, heartbreakingly beautiful. The ivory satin complementing her dark hair and pale skin, in exactly the way she had envisioned. But she was dead, and the dress she had killed herself to complete would now become her burial garment. Margaret Thornton collapsed into a chair, sobbing, asking questions that no one could answer. How had Elizabeth gotten out of bed without being heard? How had she gotten back into the locked workshop? How had she put on the dress by herself when it required assistance to fasten all of those buttons? And most disturbing, how had she continued to sew with such precision and perfection while dying? Dr. Morrison had no answers. He could document what he observed: the time of death, the probable cause being exhaustion and heart failure, the physical evidence of Elizabeth's final hours. But he could not explain how she had completed such intricate work in her condition. or how she had managed to fasten buttons on her own back that were positioned in places she couldn't have reached without help. The funeral was held 3 days later, on June 14th, in the same garden where Elizabeth's wedding was to have taken place. Thomas insisted that Elizabeth be buried in the wedding dress, saying that she had given her life to complete it and that it should remain with her forever. The service was attended by over 200 people, many of them former clients who had worn Elizabeth's creations on their own wedding days, and who wept to see the seamstress laid to rest in what would have been her greatest masterpiece. Several attendees later reported that Elizabeth looked more like a sleeping bride than a corpse, that there was something almost peaceful about her appearance, as if she had achieved exactly what she wanted and could now rest. But the mystery of how the dress had been completed continued to trouble those who knew the details of Elizabeth's final hours. Thomas hired a private investigator, a retired police detective named William Ashford, who had experience with unusual deaths. Ashford spent 2 weeks interviewing everyone who had seen Elizabeth in her final days, examining the workshop, reviewing Dr. Morrison's medical findings, trying to construct a rational explanation for what had occurred. His final report, delivered to Thomas in late June, offered no satisfying answers. According to Ashford's investigation, the workshop door had indeed been locked from the inside when Elizabeth's body was discovered, with no other means of entry. The windows were too high and too narrow for someone to have entered and assisted Elizabeth with the dress. No fingerprints other than Elizabeth's were found on the needle or thread or in the work area. Everything pointed to Elizabeth having worked alone, yet the physical impossibility remained. She could not have fastened those back buttons without assistance, could not have completed such detailed embroidery work while in a state of physical collapse, could not have maintained such perfect stitch quality while dying. Ashford's report concluded with a statement that he rarely made in his investigations. "I can document what occurred, but I cannot explain it. Either Miss Thornton possessed physical capabilities far beyond normal human capacity, or she received assistance from a source that left no trace of its presence. I find both explanations equally impossible, yet one of them must be true." In the months following Elizabeth's death, several of her clients reported unusual experiences. A young woman who had been married in one of Elizabeth's dresses the previous spring claimed that when she wore the dress, she could sometimes smell gardenias even though no flowers were present. Another bride reported that stitches in her dress that had come loose seemed to repair themselves overnight, the new stitching matching Elizabeth's distinctive technique perfectly. A third woman said that when she looked at herself in her wedding dress, she sometimes saw Elizabeth's reflection standing behind her in the mirror, smiling with approval. The workshop on Jones Street remained closed for nearly a year after Elizabeth's death. Margaret couldn't bear to enter it, leaving everything exactly as it had been found that terrible morning. Finally, in the spring of 1922, she decided to reopen the space as a memorial to her daughter, displaying some of Elizabeth's finished pieces and allowing young seamstresses to use the equipment for their training. But those who worked in the space reported feeling a presence, particularly in the late evenings when Elizabeth had typically worked. They described feeling watched, hearing the soft sound of needle and thread even when no one was sewing, sometimes finding their work corrected overnight with stitches they hadn't made but that matched Elizabeth's distinctive style. Some found this presence comforting, believing that Elizabeth's spirit continued to support the craft she had loved so much. Others found it deeply unsettling and refused to work in the space alone. Thomas Whitmore never married. He continued his architectural work in Savannah for another 40 years, becoming one of the city's most respected restoration architects, helping to preserve dozens of historic buildings that might otherwise have been demolished. But those who knew him said that he never fully recovered from losing Elizabeth, that there was a sadness in his eyes that never quite faded. He kept one photograph of her on his desk, showing her standing in her workshop holding a length of white fabric, looking at the camera with those pale blue eyes that had seen the world in terms of line and form and possibility. He died in 1964 at the age of 72, and in his will he requested to be buried beside Elizabeth in Bonaventure Cemetery, where the moss-draped oaks cast eternal shadows over the graves. The leather-bound journal where Elizabeth had documented her 217 bridal commissions was preserved by her mother and eventually donated to the Savannah Historical Society, where it remains in their textile collection. Researchers who have studied the journal note that Elizabeth's final entries, written in the weeks before her death, show increasing obsession with perfection. The sketches become more detailed, the notes more extensive, the standards more exacting. The last entry, dated June 9, 1921, just 2 days before her death, reads simply, "This must be perfect. Everything depends on perfection. I cannot rest until it is finished. I will not rest." The wedding dress itself was buried with Elizabeth, as Thomas had insisted. But several clients who attended the viewing claimed that they had carefully observed the dress's construction and could attest to its extraordinary quality. They described embroidery so detailed that it would have taken months to complete under normal circumstances. Buttonholes finished with such precision that each one appeared identical to all the others, seams that were absolutely invisible even upon close inspection. Several seamstresses who examined the dress said that they had never seen work of such quality, that it represented a level of skill that seemed almost superhuman, that they couldn't imagine how anyone could maintain such perfection while working in a state of physical collapse. Dr. Morrison, in his private notes that were discovered after his death in 1939, admitted that he had been unable to explain what he had witnessed that morning in Elizabeth's workshop. He described examining her body carefully, noting that her fingers showed evidence of extensive recent use, with small needle pricks and calluses that suggested she had been working intensively right up until the moment of death. But he also noted that her physical condition, the advanced state of exhaustion, the evidence of heart failure, should have made it impossible for her to perform the kind of detailed work he saw in the completed dress. He wrote, "I am trained to believe only what I can observe and measure, but in this case, the observable facts contradict what I know to be physically possible. Either Miss Thornton pushed herself beyond every known limit of human endurance, or something helped her complete her final work. Something that left no evidence of its presence. I prefer to believe the former, but I suspect the latter may be closer to truth." The Thornton townhouse on Jones Street remained in the family until 1947, when it was sold to a young couple who converted it into apartments. The ground floor workshop was transformed into a small shop selling antiques and vintage clothing. Over the decades, the building changed hands several times, but stories about Elizabeth persisted. Shop owners reported finding spools of thread arranged in patterns they hadn't created, needles organized by size with obsessive precision, occasionally discovering stitches in fabric that they didn't remember making. Late-night pedestrians walking past the building sometimes reported seeing lights in the windows of the former workshop, and the shadow of someone sitting at a table, bent over their work, even though the space was supposed to be empty. In 1983, a seamstress who had rented the shop space to sell custom wedding dresses reported an experience that made local newspapers. She had been working late on a particularly complex dress, struggling with an embroidery pattern that wasn't coming out correctly. She had left the dress on her work table and gone upstairs to her apartment, frustrated and exhausted. The next morning, she found the embroidery completed, finished in a style that matched what she had been attempting, but executed with a skill level far beyond her own abilities. The stitches were so small and even that they were nearly invisible, and the pattern was so intricate that she estimated it would have taken her at least 40 hours to complete. Yet it had been done overnight. The seamstress closed her shop shortly afterward, telling friends that she didn't feel comfortable working in a space where someone or something could alter her work without her knowledge. The building today houses a coffee shop on the ground floor, and the owners have embraced the story of Elizabeth Mae Thornton, displaying old photographs of her and her work, including the one photograph that exists of her wearing an example of her dresses, though not the fatal wedding dress. They tell customers about the seamstress who loved her craft so much that she gave her life to complete her masterpiece, presenting the story as a tragic romance rather than the disturbing mystery it actually represents. But late at night, when the shop is closed and the building is dark, staff members still occasionally report hearing sounds from the old workshop space, the soft rhythmic whisper of needle and thread, as if Elizabeth's work continues still, as if some part of her remains in that space, forever perfecting her craft, forever stitching, forever unable to rest until everything is absolutely perfect. What really happened in those final hours of Elizabeth Mae Thornton's life? How did she complete such intricate work while dying? Did her obsession with perfection drive her beyond the normal limits of human endurance? Or was there something else at work that night? Something that helped her finish what she had started, ensuring that her final creation would be exactly as she had envisioned it? The answers remain as mysterious as the stitches themselves, tiny and precise and ultimately inexplicable. If this story touched something in you, leave a comment telling us your thoughts about the price of perfection and the danger of obsession. And if you want more stories about artists who push themselves beyond reasonable boundaries in pursuit of their vision, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who understands that sometimes the line between dedication and obsession is thinner than the finest thread. Remember, sometimes the most beautiful creations come at the highest cost, and the pursuit of perfection can lead to places darker than we imagine. See you in the next video.